unmuted. All right, so Waltham, where it all began, the growth of Boston Manufacturing Company and the housing that grew up around it through the 1800s, what we can still see today, or some such take on that title. And as it turns out, there is still quite a bit that we can see today. And so it's well worth taking a look. I've led a tour through this area a number of times. And have also put out a tour book on this area as well as other areas in the city. And I might say, to begin with, in fact, that I would like to make some thanks here. And the first one is to Wayne McCarthy, not only for letting me speak tonight, but also because Wayne is extremely modest about his contributions to my tour books and to the Highland Survey and to everything else. I generally put together the information and ship it off to him in a file, and then he converts everything into the beautiful format it turns out to be. So definitely Wayne is a participant in all of that. I'd also like to thank the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation for both helping me gather materials at various times and for permissions, in fact, for all of these people to use some of these materials. First of all, Michael Folsom, who was the founder of the Charles River Museum, did a lot of research on the mill area. And in fact, he's the one who discovered that the original mill girl boarding houses still exist, although they've been moved. At least I believe he's the one who discovered it. And this was in the 1980s. Unfortunately, Michael is no longer with us. But I would like to thank Bob Perry, the current director, and also Ilana Winkler, who was a former executive administrator. She's now left the museum, but Ilana and I did a number of tours together of the area, and she actually was able to point out some things on the mill buildings that I was not aware of. So that was a great help. Also, Gore Place Society, Lana Lewis, who was a former archivist there, helped me do some research on materials and permission to use some materials. The Waltham Public Library, Dana Hamlin, the current archivist, and Jan Zwicker, who was a former archivist, both of them have helped me a great deal in securing materials and finding them, and also some permissions to use them from the library's collection. And also one book, I'm going to be referring to some pictures out of that book. Hopefully that won't cause any problems. The book is Run of the Mill by Steve Dunwell. And this is probably the best book that I found to help me understand the development of the textile industry, especially in America. And I highly recommend it to anyone who does have an interest in textile, the history of the textile industry. I've used a number of other sources for this talk, but it's too many to present to you now during the talk, and I encourage you, if interested, to acquire a copy of my tour of the Mill Village area from the Society, which has all the references in it. So first of all, let's kind of orient ourselves to what we're going to be talking about and what we're not going to be talking about tonight. This is a map of Waltham along the river from 1854. And at that time, there were 3 different sites, locations in Waltham that had facilities from the Boston Manufacturing Company. The first one is up here. This was the Moody Street Mill Complex. Moody Street's just off to the left. And this is the area that we're going to be talking about tonight. However, the Boston Manufacturing Company, and I'll probably say BMC often when I refer to the Boston Manufacturing Company, also had the bleachery, as you know, the bleachery section of Waltham. So this is Willow Street coming down here to River Street. And so this area was also part of the BMC. And down in the south, today's south side of Waltham, but when it first started in the early 1800s, it was part of Newton. This area down here, which consisted of the Newton Chemical Company. It says Waltham Chemical Company, but the actual name was Newton Chemical Company. So that's Newton Street coming down here, and this is Pine Street coming across here, and so that's where the location of the company was. So all three of these sections of the BMC had housing associated with them, but I'm only going to be talking about this area here, the Moody Street Mills at this point. You might notice, while I have this map up, that there are two railroad lines shown, and they're important. This is the Fitchburg line here, which still exists, of course, coming through by Central Square. And this is, by the way, is Elm Street here, to give you some orientation. So the Fitchburg main line coming through here, but also there used to be, from 1851 until fairly recently, the Watertown branch of the Fitchburg line came through Watertown and then passed the bleachery over a trestle over the river, which was removed by just fairly recently, and looped down by the Newton Chemical Company, and then back up to the mill here, and then rejoin the Fitchburg main line up by the mill, the Moody Street mill. The Newton Chemical Company, by the way, produced sulfuric acid, which was used in the bleaching process back here at the bleachery. So materials were then easily transported back and forth on the Watertown branch line. So to orient ourselves in the area that I will be talking about, here is the Moody Street Mill complex today, the footprint of it. This is Moody Street coming across, coming across the river here. This is Carter Street, the common is here. This is Elm Street here, which comes over here and then across the river here. This, by the way, was the old trestle for the Watertown line coming across the river there. And then, of course, River Street comes along here, Newton Street here, and Central Street here. So, to begin with, Waltham did not start out as a manufacturing city. It has a rich history that goes back to the founding of Boston and Watertown in 1630. In fact, the history goes back even further than that, because our main street was one of the primary Native American trails going west from the coast. And so even predating European settlement, this area was important. So when you get stuck in traffic congestion on Main Street, just think, you know, it's been like that for many hundreds of years. This picture is from a woodcut that appeared in Massachusetts Magazine in 1793. And it's a picture, the title of it was Edenvale. And it's a picture of, in fact, the current site of the Moody Street BMC mills. But this was a paper mill that was built in 1790 by John Boyce, and the last name is spelled B-O-I-E-S, but judging from old deeds, how it's written in some old deeds, that probably was pronounced Boyce at the time. He founded his mill in 1790. This is Moody Street coming down to the river. This is most likely the river here. It's a little hard to tell in this woodcut, but that certainly looks like a boat to me in the river, and these certainly look like ducks. So this is the river here, and the dam was here, and you can see the water wheel from the Boyce paper mill over here. And the rest of Waltham was extremely rural at that time, turn of the 1800s. You can see back over here, vaguely, a steeple. That's the meeting house, the one meeting house in town, and that was located about where the traffic circle is now on Beaver Street. So here is a map of what Waltham looked like about the time that the Boston Manufacturing Company was founded. This map is from 1819, and it's in the collection of the Boston Public Library. Most of the population of Waltham at that time was along Trapelo Road here, So this is Trapelo Road up here along the north part of the town. So it was along Trapelo Road, it was along Lincoln Street, which is here, on Winter Street here, and in the Piety Corner area here. Now, Main Street, which came along here, also had houses along it, but it had a lot of taverns. Not only was Main Street originally a Native American trail going west from the coast, but it was also part of the Boston Post Road system, and for much of the colonial era, it was the main route by which farms out west of Waltham were able to ship their produce into Boston. It was the main road, often called the Great Country Road for that reason. So those were the population centers at the time. We'll take a closer look down here at the mill area in a moment. I would want to point out here, though, again, talking about the longevity of the history, this street here is Pleasant Street. And at that time, Pleasant Street went all the way through to the meeting house, which was, as I say, at the traffic circle on Beaver Street. Pleasant Street was actually laid out in 1669 as a cow path, as a path through the forest to be able to move the cattle herds from Watertown Center over here up into the meadows for summer feeding that were up here in Waltham. So the town's history certainly goes back very far. However, once the Boston Manufacturing Company came to town in 1814, everything changed. And that is due to this man here, Francis Cabot Lowell. And unfortunately, this is the only likeness we have of Lowell. And there are no actual pictures of him. Lowell died fairly young in 1817, and there were no paintings done of him, just the silhouette. Now, Lowell was a well-off Boston merchant who visited England just before the War of 1812, and then returned to Boston and was able to recreate a water-powered loom for weaving textiles like the ones that he had seen while he was touring mills in England. And so far in America, there was no water-powered weaving. There was water-powered spinning of yarn already, but nothing to use water power to actually produce textiles from the yarn. And so he was the first one that introduced that idea. And this shows a picture of his loom. This is the Boston Manufacturing Company logo. And unfortunately, this is the best image we have of what that early loom looked like. Unfortunately, we don't have any detailed drawings of it. The folks at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation have done a great job of trying to recreate what that early loom looked like. And there is, I believe, a working model of it at the museum, and I highly recommend, if you're interested in the history of the industry at all, that you visit the Charles River Museum if you haven't already. Now, aiding Lowell in the development of the loom was his brother-in-law, Patrick Tracy Jackson. And I know you've all heard the name Paul Moody. Of course, Moody Street is named after. And Paul Moody was very instrumental in employing the mills and improving improving the looms and actually getting a working factory going. But the original loom itself was really developed by Francis Cabot Lowell and Patrick Tracy Jackson. Now, in 1813, so the loom was developed in 1812. 1813, Francis Cabot Lowell founded the Boston Manufacturing Company and started looking for a place to site his new mill. And just at that time, by coincidence, Sir John Boyce was interested in selling his mill privilege on the Charles River in Edenvale. And so that's basically why the Boston Manufacturing Company ended up here in Waltham. The charter that Lowell received from the legislature in order to incorporate his factory stipulated that it had to be within 15 miles of Boston. And here was a mill site with a 10-foot waterfall, which was sufficient for Lowell's purposes, within 15 miles of Boston. And so that's how come we became basically the birthplace of the American industrial system. So let's take a closer look again at what the area looked like at that time. So this is a map from 1819 again, close in now, of the river, and the Boston Manufacturing Company was located here. Again, this is Main Street. This, by the way, is Grove Street today. And Grove Street at that time came up Bright Street and met Main Street near where right now the trestle bridge is over the railroad. And now down here, downstream from the Boston Manufacturing Company was another factory, the Waltham Cotton and Woolen factory. But that was not as successful as the Boston Manufacturing Company. And in fact, in 1819, the Boston Manufacturing Company bought out the Waltham Cotton and Woolen factory and then connected the two by River Street. So you'll notice on this map, River Street does not appear, as well as all the other streets in the area don't appear. Okay, so hop in your helicopter and grab your time machine, and let's go back to the 1820s and take a look at what the mill complex looked like in the 1820s. And so this is a model of the mill at the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. And it's easy to point out here the different features of what the mill complex consisted of at that time. This building here was the first mill that was built. So that was built under the direction of Francis Cabot Lowell in 1814. The company was founded in 1813. The mill building was built in 1814, and the machines put in it, the looms and spinning machines. And the first cloth was produced in 1815. Well, this mill was such a financial success, both technically and financially, that it encouraged the investors to come up with a second mill next to it. And that second mill next to it, you'll notice, is larger than the first mill. And this mill then became the model, the prototype, for most of the other mills that sprang up within the next 5-10 years from this construction. So this second mill was built between about 1816 and 1818. And to give you some idea of connections, the technology that was developed here and this mill at this scale is what was then shipped off to the town of Lowell. And so Lowell, with all of their textile history, actually was founded in 1822, so quite a bit after the Waltham mill, and by basically the same people who founded the Waltham mill. And the technology that was developed here was then implemented a few years later up in Lowell. Also notice here in this model, this road here is actually aligned with River Street out to the right here. And you can imagine this is Moody Street coming down here. And so today, this is actually the driveway that goes in to the mill complex. And aligned on the north side of that driveway were this was this row of boarding houses for the mill girls who were the primary labor force for the mills. And we'll talk a great deal more about these boarding houses very soon. But I first wanted to mention what it was that made this mill so successful that they then went on and built a second mill, and why it became a model, why the corporate structure became a model for the American industrial system. There were four basic aspects to the system that Lowell set up, and it became known as the Waltham system. The first one was the use of water power for the looms, and putting the water-powered looms, the water-powered spinning machines, and the rest in one factory building, all under one roof. That was the first time it was done in America. The second was the corporate structure that Francis Cabot Lowell set up, which was based on joint stock ownership of the company. Before this, all of the textile mills had been either private or partnerships. This one was the first one that was based on a joint stock organization. Also, the management structure consisted of a board of directors and a full-time agent in charge of the operation of the mill. So that was the second point. The third point was that as a follow-on from the joint stock ownership, there was a very, very large capitalization of this mill, far larger than any mill that had existed in America before. And this meant that they could build a large mill to begin with. So even this first mill, which was smaller than the second mill, this first mill was far larger than any other mill that existed in America at the time. And they could easily update the machinery because they had the capital to do that as technology advanced, so they could keep up with the advancing technological innovations. And the company could also weather downturns in the economy, and it also had political clout because it was so large. The fourth difference between other factories at the time and what characterized the Waltham system was the use of mill girls. And these were the young adult daughters off neighboring farms who were skilled, intelligent, and motivated to do this. Before, mills generally had, employed families, whole families in their operation, including little kids and so on and so forth. And to give you an idea of how many mill girls were employed, in 1817, we actually have employment numbers. And in 1817, so probably in 1817, just this mill was in operation, I think, because this mill wasn't finished until 1818, so maybe partly operating, I'm not sure. But there were at that time 108 women employed by the Boston Manufacturing Company and only 96 men. And of those 96 men, most of them were employed here in the machine shop that was manufacturing the looms and spinning machines that would go into the factory. So that the primary labor force then was the mill girls for the mill. But what this meant was that in order to secure this workforce, the company needed to have proper and attractive boarding houses for these young single women. And so that's where the housing comes into all of this, and that's these boarding houses along here. Now, what remains today of this complex? Well, amazingly enough, the outside walls of these buildings, at least the bottom 3 floors, still remains. all of these boarding houses that you can see here, and there are 10 of them, all 10 of those boarding houses, amazingly enough, still exist today. And we'll be taking a look at them a little later in this lecture. And there's one other thing that exists that's shown in this diorama, and that's up here at the top of the cupola on the first mill. There's a weather vane, and that weather vane we still have in the collection of the Waltham Historical Society. So this is a weather vane that was made in Boston in 1815, and it used to be on the old mill, and we now have it in our collection. Okay, so how do we know what the mill actually looked like and the other buildings around? This is a painting that was done of the mill, attributed to Elijah Smith Jr., and the dates are not clear on it. I've seen references that say that this picture was painted around 1830, but in fact, Elijah Smith Jr. died in 1828. And so I know there are other sources that say this picture was probably 1826 to 1828. It was sometime in the 1820s and before 1829, certainly. This church, which you can see over here at this end, is actually the second religious society meeting house. And that church was located on the corner of School and Church Street, opposite side of Church Street from today's First Parish, so in the McDivitt school yard there. However, this church burned after a lightning strike in 1829. So this picture was definitely before 1829. Some other features here, well, of course, these are the two mills that you saw in the diorama. The first mill here from 1814, the second mill from 1816 to 1818, the machine shop here. This house here, I believe, is the end of what was called the Long Block, which was kind of a row house of apartments, which was demolished in 1889. And so that does not exist anymore. But the Mill Girl boarding houses, I believe, here's one two-story boarding house here, and a one-story this side of it and one story this side of it. The rest are obscured by the trees. So this picture, by the way, is now in the possession of Gore Place Society, and is viewable at Gore Place. Okay, well, let's go back actually here. Well, notice just behind these two people here, this is the dam and falls on the river here, and then the two mill buildings here as we come along. Well, if we move to today, and then we see almost the same site. This is standing behind the parking lot, behind the cinema, with a bridge that goes over across the river to what's known as Landry Park here, beside the mill buildings. Here is the falls, and this is the end of the original mill building here. Sorry for the obfuscation here of the trees. And so this was the first mill building here. This was the second mill building here. And then in 1843, they were connected together by an additional mill building between them. And to help understand what we're seeing and the development of the mill through the years, this is a map of the mill that used to be on a stanchion in Landry Park, but it disappeared a number of years ago after being vandalized. But there is a copy of it in the Charles River Museum of Industry and Innovation. And so again, this is the dam and waterfall here. This is the original mill from 1814 at this end. A little further on is the 1816-1818 mill here. And then the infill mill from 1843. And then there was another mill that was added on in 1852. here. And then other mill portions added in 1873 here and 1880 here. And then in 1890, this building here was added. When this building was added, that caused the original row of boarding houses that were along here to be moved. And so we'll talk about that later. The famous chimney on the mill is over here, and that was part of a later boiler house from the early 1900s. Now you notice also here that the roof structure was changed around 1890. And so originally the roof structure looked like this on the mill. So this is looking at that original mill with the original kind of roof structure on it. This picture here is from just before the 1890 change so this is actually a photograph of the old Moody Street Bridge here and what the mill building, the original mill building, looked like around 1890. Now this is what it looks like today. This is looking from the Moody Street Bridge across the river at the mills. This is the section closest to Moody Street, which is the original mill building here from 1814. This is the second mill here that was built 1816 to 1818. And this is the infill mill. And the way you can tell is by looking at the bottom row of windows. And you can see here that there's a sudden change in the level of the windows. And so that shows which is the infill mill. So this was the second mill here, this was the first mill, and this is the infill mill here in between. And if we now go sort of touring along the building, back here you can see just the end of the mill section that was added in 1852. So this is that 1852 mill building now. And you can see the end of the additional mill that was built in 1873 here. And that's the end of that 1873 mill with the iconic smokestack next to it. And then this is the other end of that building, the 1880 mill building here. Now, for those of you who are familiar with this mill complex, if you've ever tried to drive down this driveway to kind of the back of the museum down here, you may have wondered why this obstacle, this wall segment obstacle is still in the way of getting into the parking lot there. Well, it turns out this wall segment is actually very historic. This is the last remaining part of what once was a stone schoolhouse. And so this is a stone school. It was built in 1837 by the Boston Manufacturing Company for the education of the kids, the children of the mill workers, but also it wasn't limited to just the mill workers. It was open to any of the town kids who were living there at that time. And in fact, the BMC in Waltham, anyways, was a very benevolent organization for the town. It helped the town out in many, many different ways. It had schools, made schools for children. It laid out a number of roads in town, as I say, River Street and widened Newton Street and things like that. And Elm Street it put in. It established stores. One of the other features, actually, of the Waltham system that Francis Cabot Lowell introduced was that instead of paying the mill girls and the other workers in the mill in company scrip, which could only be redeemed at the company store, it actually paid the workers in money, in dollars and cents, which they could spend in any store or whatever. And so the store then that the company set up was available to the entire community to use, not just to mill workers. It helped establish churches. The Second Religious Society in particular was established with the help of the mill, as well as a number of churches that followed that. It established the first fire brigade and equipped it in Waltham. And also it established the Rumford Institute, which was an adult education organization. And we'll come back to the Rumford Institute in a little while here. So before we go on, I did want to say a little bit about the technology of the mills, because it was the change in technology that allowed the mill to grow. Once the first two mills were built by 1818, for the technology, the original technology that was used, all of the power available in the water was used up. And so they couldn't build any other mills in Waltham. They couldn't expand the mill they had unless there were advances in the technology. So this is the original technology, the water power technology that was used in the original mill. And so this is looking at the side of a mill. This is actually one that was in England, but it looks very similar to what the mill here in Waltham would have looked like, especially the first mill. And so this is the water wheel, and the water wheel was not at the side of the mill the way it was for the John Boyce paper mill, but in fact, it was in the basement in the center of the mill. There was a wheel pit, as they called it, in the center of the basement of the mill. If you look at the side view, this is a different mill, so it doesn't quite line up, but it does give you an idea of what it looked like. The water came in through the side of the building, ran through the water wheel, turned the water wheel, and then ran out the other side of the building. So here you can see the water coming out of the side of the building here from this water wheel. The turning of that water wheel turned this very big, heavy cast iron gear, which meshed with a miter gear here, and turned this very heavy shaft here. Now, given the technology, the metalworking technology of the day, these gears did not mesh very well. They ran very rough. It was very noisy, a lot of vibration, and also very inefficient. And so a lot of the power available in the water coming through was lost to friction in all this gearing and the heavy shaft here that was turning and then being distributed to the machines up on the upper floors. So to see what that looks like here in the mill in Waltham, this is now looking at the other side of that original mill. And by the way, it's interesting, the sign up here on the mill building, that this face, of course, faces Moody Street. You may have noticed this plaque on that says 1813. And that was a big controversy because the top of the mill, remember, was this part here was changed in the 1890s. And I think at that time, they probably put this plaque in. 1813 is when the company was founded, but the mill building itself was built in 1814. And so I know in the Historical Society, there was a lot of controversy over whether that number should be changed or not. At any rate, this is the original mill building here. This is the parking lot for the senior housing in these buildings today. And it was through this parking lot that the water channel, which was called the power canal, came in, bringing the water along the side of the building that they could then go through the building. So here's a historic photograph from about 1900 of that same view. So this is again the same mill here. In fact, you can see the plaque there. And this water power canal came in and brought the water through where the parking lot is now, and then side channels led the water into the buildings, to the sides of the buildings. And I think this structure here is probably a control works for the water that was going into the side of the building. And so it fed the other mills down as it went along. And in fact, today, the only thing that remains of that power canal is its mouth. And so if you come down to this end of the building and walk over to here, you can actually see there's a plaque in the ground here that commemorates the mouth of the power canal coming in here. Another feature, and something that Ilana Winkler pointed out to me, in fact, is this is the side of the mill facing the parking lot. So the parking lot is over here on the right. And if you look down here in the foundation, you can see an odd formation of the brickwork here. And here's a closer picture of it. This very possibly is an arch supporting the opening in the wall in the side of the mill in which the water went through. Okay, so looking at then the advances in the technology for water power through the beginning of the 1800s, so well, the first half of the 1800s, there were a number of advances in water power that were then applied to the mill. And in fact, if anyone has really more documentation on the changes that were made in our mill, I'd be very happy to know about that. I know in theory what the advances were in the technology, but I don't know the exact dates necessarily of when they were applied to the mills in Waltham. So one of the major improvements was that instead of using miter gears and those heavy shafts to transmit the water power to the machines, belts and pulleys were used, leather belts and large metal pulleys were used, which had much less friction than the huge miter gears and shafts, heavy shafts had. And so with better efficiency, more power than that was available in the water could be transmitted to more machines. And so you can enlarge the mills then to accommodate more spinning and more weaving machines. The other advance was shown down here, water turbines. And so this is a sketch of what a water turbine looked like about 1850. You can think of a water turbine here as being like a pinwheel. You know, one of those pinwheels you hold up vertically and the wind blows through it and the blades turn. Well, if you held that pinwheel horizontally, and blew down at it, it would be like the water coming in through this pipe and moving through the blades of the turbine here and coming out the bottom. And again, the turbine was much more efficient than the water wheel. And again, then more power was available to operate more machines. And the final big increase in power technology was the introduction of steam engines. And the first steam engine was introduced in the mills in 1836. And of course, that's when only the first two mills existed. And it was introduced because during periods of dry weather, there wasn't enough flow in the river to power all of the machines that were in the mill, even at that time. And so they brought in an auxiliary steam engine to tide over the times when the water flow was insufficient. But then in around 1850, so steam engine technology improved. And it was improved by a guy named George Corliss. I believe he was in Rhode Island. He was definitely New England engineer. And he developed a way of introducing steam into the piston. So this is the piston over here. And he developed a valve that introduced the steam into the piston in a way that saved steam and made the operation of everything much smoother and more economical. I have a personal connection, I guess, to George Corliss because one of his descendants, Peter Corliss, was a student of mine at BU in engineering at one time. So by 1850, more and more steam power was being used in the mills. Okay, so let's. Another thing to say about the steam power, by the way, is that the railroad came to Waltham, was built from Boston to Waltham initially in 1843. It reached Waltham in 1843. And one of the big advantages of the railroad was that you could transport coal by the railroad. And it was also around this time in the mid-early 1800s that coal fields were discovered and developed in eastern Pennsylvania, and steam trains were being employed in eastern Pennsylvania to bring the coal to Philadelphia, where it was then transshipped to boats that could bring it up to Boston, and then by train again, steam train from Boston to Waltham in order to power these steam engines. And it's possible, then it seems to me, that the reason why the additional mill, the infill mill of 1843 that connected the two original mills may have been built in 1843 because of this greater availability of coal to run the steam engine with at that time. Okay, so now let's look at how the housing developed related to the development of the mills. This is a 1918 map of the section of Waltham between Elm Street here and Newton Street over on the right. And this is River Street down along the bottom here. And so this area down here from about the Fitchburg Railroad to the river and from Elm Street to Newton Street was the area where there was housing that was supported, either built or later on bought by the BMC for its employees. And what's really interesting is that all of these buildings with the green dots on them are buildings that existed in the 1800s, some going back to the first days of the mill, 1817, but all of these with green dots on them are buildings that still exist along River Street. So we're going to start and look at these buildings that still exist. Before that, though, let's take a look at Waltham's population to understand how the housing needs changed with time in Waltham. So remember, the mill was established in 1814, so it occurred between 1810 and 1820. This is census data, US Census data for Waltham. So in 1810, before the mill came to Waltham, the population was about 1,000. By 1820, the population had soared to 2/3 more than that, to about 1,677 people. And of course, most of that increase were these mill girls. And so they needed then a lot of these boarding houses to house them. And then, so you can see this 65% increase in the population between 1810 and 1820. I mean, can you imagine a 66% increase in the population today, what it would mean? And then the other large surge in population increase was between about 1840 and 1860. And of course, there are a number of reasons for this large population increase at this time. First of all, Waltham annexed the south side in 1849. So some of this increase is because of the south side, but most of the people who were living in the south side were actually working for the Boston Manufacturing Company, either the Moody Street Mills or the chemical company or the bleachery. Also, of course, in 1854, the watch factory started, although the watch factory probably didn't employ that many people yet in this period, certainly not between 1840 and 1850 before it was established. But of course, this corresponded to the huge Irish immigration into the city. There were Irish, some Irish in Waltham before this, but this is when the great immigration occurred from Ireland. And now, why did they come to Waltham? Well, they came to Waltham because here there were jobs in the mill and the other companies associated with the Boston Manufacturing Company. Now, also looking at these figures, we can see how this affected the housing. Here in 1820, where there was this large increase, this was mostly, as I say, the single mill girls who needed the boarding houses to live in. Whereas this large increase here was mostly of families. And the labor force for the mills changed during this period, roughly around 1840, 1830, 1840. The mill girls found that it wasn't so attractive anymore to work in the mill environment. They now were able to become school teachers and clerks. The western frontier of America was opening up, and many of them moved there as young wives. And so to substitute for them as a labor force, also there was a lot of labor unrest. These young Yankee women wouldn't put up with the treatment that they were starting to get in the mills. And so when the Irish labor force came in, it replaced those mill girls, but this labor force needed apartments, family apartments to live in, rather than boarding houses to a large extent. And so during this period, there was a lot more construction of apartments, either in duplexes or boarding house or row houses in the city. Okay, so let's go back now and look at that housing in more detail. So back to our model here. And now let's consider in more detail this row of original boarding houses here. There were 7 original mill girl boarding houses that were built 1817 to 1818. And you can see them here. They go from here over to here. And there were 4 single-story boarding houses. Here's one single story, here's a second single story, third single story, and fourth single story boarding house. And between them are 2-story boarding houses. So originally there were 4 single-story boarding houses and 3 2-story boarding houses from 1817 to 1818. Then in the early 1820s, a 2-story boarding house was added at this end of the row. Remember, this is Moody Street here. And 2 boarding houses at least were added at this end. There might have been a third one. That third one has disappeared anyway. If it did, I mean, it did exist at some point. I don't know when it was built, but these 2 are still in existence, as well as this one from the early 1820s, as well as all of these 7 original boarding houses. If we take another look at that model from behind, then you can see this is one of the 2-story original boarding houses, single story, 2-story, single story, 2-story, single story, 2-story, single story. So these were the 7 original ones. You'll notice here that there's a back wing that comes out of the house. That's usually called a rear L, ELL for the house. And generally it's thought that these rear Ls contain kind of common areas such as dining halls and kitchens for the boarding houses. Now, I'm not sure why the model makers at the Charles River Museum didn't put rear Ls on the single-story boarding houses, because we certainly know they were there by 1854. So how do we know actually what those boarding houses looked like? Well, the answer is because there are other paintings from that era that in fact show those boarding houses. Now, here is a mystery. This picture appears in a book by Charles Nelson that was written in 1879 on the history of Waltham. And this is a picture that appears in that book. It's titled, actually it's not said BMC, it said Cotton Mills in 1820. It was the title on the picture. Now, in Nelson's book, there's no reference to where this picture came from. So I don't know where this picture came from, but it looks awful lot like another picture we have that we do know where it came from. So first of all, let's understand this picture, and then we'll look at that other picture. So here are the 2 original mills. There's the first mill that was built in 1814. Here's a second mill that was built between 1816 and 1818. And here's that row of boarding houses here. This coming out here is River Street. And you probably didn't notice, but River Street actually does bend there. But pay attention to the fact that there's this fence that comes down here, as well as the fences along River Street, and the river is over here. We'll come back to those details in a minute here. But to give you an idea of what we're looking at, this is an aerial photo taken from Google Earth of that same scene. So this is Jackson Street coming down here to River Street. And so the picture, the painting was probably painted by someone standing right about here where my pointer is, at the corner, near the corner of Jackson and River Street, and looking over in this direction. Here are the original mills over here. There's that first mill there and the second mill here. This is River Street here as it curves into the mill complex. This is the Worldwide building now, which houses the artist studios. And it, in fact, is taking the place of where the mill girl boarding houses used to be. So the row of them was along here. So then if we look back at this picture here, we can see that curve in River Street, the row of mill girl boarding houses, and the two mills here along the river. Okay, and again, remember, when we go forward here, these people, the cart and the woman by the cart in this picture. So taking a closer look at those mill girl boarding houses, and I'm sorry it's so blurry, here were the original 7. A single story, double story, single story, double story, single story, double story, single story. 4 single story, 3 double story. And then 1 more double story at the end of that line. River Street wasn't built until about 1820, so this house was probably built sometime around 1820. The end boarding house here. Now, this is the picture we do know something about. And this picture, unfortunately, I can't say where it is now. I don't know. It's owned by a private owner. It used to be on display at Gore Place, I believe. This picture of it comes from one that I took of a reproduction of it that was in the basement of the senior housing at the mill today. There's also a picture like this in the Charles River Museum in their exhibition on the history of the mill. And also it can be found on the end page, the cover, inside cover of Waltham Rediscovered. So it definitely is out there, but I don't know where the original is. But look at the comparison between this painting and the other one that occurred in Nelson's book, that was published in Nelson's book. Here we have River Street curving in to the row of mill girl boarding houses. Here we have that rail fence coming down to River Street. Here's the river over here. Here are the original 2 mills, and here's the row of mill girl boarding houses. And taking a closer look, but notice back here actually that the people are different, right? There's no cart here in the road and no woman approaching that cart in the road. Instead, there's a horse with a guy holding it over here. So they're not exactly the same picture. And in fact, the boarding houses are different too. Here's the row of original 7, single story, double, single, double, single, double, single. But now there's a double story added at this end and another double story added at this end. And so this painting has on the back of it, says that it was painted by Elijah Smith Jr., 1824. And Elijah Smith Jr., by the way, I think I mentioned, died in 1828. He was the brother of the great-great-grandmother of Elizabeth Kastner, Betty Kastner, for those of you who might have known her. And so, you know, he was definitely a real person, but he died in 1828. Anyway, if we can say that the painting that occurred in that's presented in Nelson's book is really from about 1820, and this one is from 1824, then that means that this boarding house at this end and this boarding house at this end were built sometime between 1820 and 1824. The 7 original ones were built about 1817, 1818, And this boarding house here was built sometime around 1820. Now, where are those boarding houses on the maps? So this is a map from 1819, and here is the row here of those boarding houses. I don't think that the number of dots is an accurate representation of how many boarding houses there were at that period, because this dot here shows is much smaller, and that's the long block, which was actually quite long. And again, no River Street. This is a map here from 1831, and you can see 1831, we do have River Street extending between the two mills now. We have a number of individual houses along River Street here, and here are those mill girl boarding houses here along River Street by the mill. Notice these roads that go behind the mill houses, because the next map here is from 1854, giving a much more accurate picture of the footprints of those houses. And so here are the 7 original mill girl houses here. Here's the one at the western end that was from 1820 to 1824. Here are the ones on the eastern end from probably 1820 to 1824. And here is that roadway behind those mill girl boarding houses here. So while we're looking at this map, if you take a look at the shape of the footprints of the houses, they kind of have this T shape. So that's the main boarding house there with the rear L sticking out the back. And you'll notice that all 7 of those original boarding houses have a single L out the back end of the house. If we now move forward in time, this map is from 1875. And what you can see is that of the original boarding houses, so these are the 7 original boarding houses here, the single story ones still have a single L in the back, but the double story original mill girl boarding houses, the L's have been converted from a long single L in the middle to 2 short stubby L's on either end of the boarding houses. And we'll come back to that as we move forward. Some other evidence of what the boarding houses looked like. This is a photograph that was taken probably from a church steeple on the other side of Moody Street across the common here, and looking at the back of the mill. And you can see the mill girl boarding houses through here. There's one of those single story mill girl boarding houses with its L out the back. Here is a double story with one of those short L's at the side here. Here's the other double story. Here's another short L you can see here. So that row went all along here, although it's obscured by other stuff in the foreground here. This is a little closer up. Maybe it's easier to see, I'm not sure. This is that single story original mill girl boarding house here. This is one of the double story ones. This is one of the double story ones. There's that short L there. There's another short L here, and so on. If we look at another photograph, this photograph is from 1886, which is in a book in the Historical Society collection. This is the western end of that row. This is one of those single story original mill girl boarding houses here. And this is the double story boarding house that's at the end of the row. And you'll notice it has the rear L here in the center, and then it had side wings off of it. And we'll come back to the significance of that later on. Okay, so those original mill girl boarding houses, remember, were in this row along this extension of River Street, which is really the driveway now into the mill complex. Moody Street's back over here in the background. And this, of course, is the Worldwide Building with the artist studios in it. And that's exactly where the mill girl boarding houses were. So in 1889, they were moved. And this is what was discovered by Michael Folsom in the 1980s, I believe. So of those original 7 mill girl boarding houses, the single story ones, and those are shown by the orange lines here, the move of these 4 single story boarding houses were moved over here to what became Jackson Place. So this is Jackson Street here, and this is Jackson Place here. the double story, the original double story Mill Girl boarding houses, these three here, and remember, notice the stubby double L's on them, were moved over here along Lawton Place, over here. And so here you can see these are the 4 single-story boarding houses after they were moved. Here are the 3 double-story boarding houses after they moved, and you can kind of see the stubby little L's on them there. And so here's what they look like now. These are the 3 original Mill Girl boarding houses from 1817 to 1818. These are the earliest Mill Girl boarding houses anywhere in the nation. They are, in fact, national treasures, which most people don't even recognize what they are. This is Lawton Place here. This row house here was built in 1889, the same year that these houses were moved onto Lawton Place. Here's another view of that. I happened to catch it on a day when the fence was down, being replaced or something, so you can get a better idea of what it looks like. Here is that stubby, one of the 2 stubby rear L's on this boarding house. So these are the 3 original 2-story Mill Girl boarding houses. This is what they look like in the back, and again, those 2 stubby L's on both sides. You can see on this one and over here on the next one, and so on down the line. And this is the one at the end of the line here, the third one at the end of the line. Again, the same construction with the stubby double L's in the back. Probably at the time of the move, these dormers were added, and the hood was probably added over the door. That was more characteristic for later in the 1800s than early 1800s. These are the single-story Mill Girl boarding houses as they appear today. These 2 still have mostly their same form. The roofs were changed slightly to be pyramid-type roofs rather than the gable-type roofs. And this one's been modified considerably on one side. This one is pretty much unchanged except for a brick veneer on it. Now, this is what it looks like from the rear with that single L coming out the back of the single-story boarding houses. So these 4 boarding houses, again, these 4 houses now, again, are original Mill Girl boarding houses from 1817 to 1818. Now, I was lucky enough to be able to get in to the basement of this one to examine the structure. These houses, built in the early 1800s, had to have been built by post and beam construction, timber frame construction. And so that's what we see if we look in the basement. These are the beams that support the floor, the first floor of that house. And you can see the size of these beams in that small little house. But this is a smoking gun here. That's the tip of a tree nail or trunnel, which was the wooden pin that held together the mortise and tenon type of joint that was used to connect these big beams in post and beam construction. And here's another view of the floor and the joist holding up the floor, and you can see it certainly doesn't look like a modern joist. It's very shallow, only about 4 inches deep, and it's not being held by nails or anything into the beams here. It's again a kind of mortise and tenon joint into the beams. So this is definitely early 1800s construction, confirming that these were the original Mill Girl boarding houses. This is another house that's nearby in Waltham, not from the Boston Manufacturing Company, but one I was able to get in the basement. This dates from the mid-1800s. Construction is now more modern, although notice that these brick columns here are holding up the hearth where the fireplace was in the first floor of this house. But if you notice here that the joists, sorry if that keeps getting in the way, the joists are much more modern joists, more like 2x8s than what we saw in that old early 1800 timber frame house. Okay, going back to those early original boarding houses. These were the original 7 boarding houses. Remember, there was this one on the end of the line here that had this funny H footprint because it has those wings out the back. And in fact, let me remind you, this is a picture of that. So this boarding house dates from probably between 1820 and 1824. It had the L out the back and then 2 wings, one on either side of the single story constructions here. This is what it looks like today. It was moved to River Street. And in fact, let me go back here. It was moved from this position here all the way down over to here on River Street. Now, this, I believe, I'm the first one to recognize that this house sitting here on River Street is in fact one of those mill girl boarding houses from the mill from the 1820s. So here you can see the H footprint here, and over here you can see kind of, it has still that kind of H footprint to it. So again, this is what it looked like in 1886, and this is what it looks like today. The same house. There's been some change in the fenestration in the front here, and again, the roof over those wings has been changed from a gable roof to a pyramid, a hip kind of roof here. But otherwise, that's a boarding house, a mill girl boarding house from the early 1820s. So now let's look at these 3 mill girl boarding houses from the early 1820s that were on the east side of Elm Street. So we'll work our way down River Street here. In 1869, the railroad that came through here decided it wanted to put another spur going east here. And so to do that, it had to move these 3 boarding houses, these 3 Boston Manufacturing Company related houses. In fact, there was an article in the May 7th, 1869 Waltham newspaper, the Sentinel, that says the dwellings on River Street still keep changing places. The first tenement is on the tour. The railroad men have taken possession. So again, I think I'm the first one to realize that the houses that still exist on River Street, in fact, were these early boarding houses, but that they've been moved. And so if we look at this one, it has, again, an H type of footprint on it. It was moved from here over to here. Now, the Whitman house, the Field house, and the Newhall house here, we know where they were. In fact, the Newhall house became the Lawton house, and the Field house became the Warren house, and the Whitman house was bought by the Boston Manufacturing Company in 1860. And so that's why it's under Boston Manufacturing Company here now. And so the Boston Manufacturing Company moved this boarding house over to here and plunked it down here. This is the 1854 map. This is the 1875 map after the move was done. And so to give you some idea, again, photographic evidence, this is the spur of the Watertown branch coming across the river on a railroad trestle. Again, this trestle was just recently removed by the DCR. And notice this picture is from about 1900, so just before the new boiler house and big chimney were built. And it was up here that that spur went off to the east. And so this picture we know dates from 1898 because there was an accident on the railroad. And so this was one of the pictures to document the legal case for that accident. And so these were the 2 boarding houses. This is the one that was moved from further to the left here to make way for this railroad spur line coming in. And so that boarding house today is this house here sitting on River Street, again with its rear L. The dormer and the enclosed porch are later additions from the 1900s. Notice the form of this house, it's very squat. It's kind of wide and low. The windows are hard up against the eaves, typical construction for early federal period, kind of late Georgian period architecture. So that's, again, one of the boarding houses. And this one, in fact, was on the picture in Nelson, so that this boarding house probably dates from about 1820. And then if we look at the second boarding house next to it, that was shown in the 1824 painting, so that one, I believe, was moved across, it was across the river, across this River Street, over to this location here. And this is what it looks like today. The rear L, I think, was split into two side wings because of the big drop off in elevation towards the river on that side of River Street. But again, notice the construction is exactly the same as the white one we looked at before. Very wide, the massing of it is very squat, and the windows hard up under the eaves here. Definitely early federal period, late Georgian kind of architecture. The third house that got moved was this one on the south side of River Street. Now, this is the 1854 map here. We know that this house did not exist in the before 1841, because there's an 1841 map of Waltham that I haven't shown that does not show any houses on the south side of River Street on it. So this was originally built sometime after 1841, and in 1869, it was either moved over, and so here we can see how it was moved over, or it was reconstructed. And that's this row house here. And what makes this interesting is because if in fact this row house was built in 1869, or in fact built earlier and then just refurbished in 1869, then it's the earliest example we have in this area anyways of a Boston Manufacturing Company row house. A row house was done for apartments, not for boarding houses. And so this was, of course, after the large influx of families, the Irish, especially workforce of Irish with families to support. This is looking at the other end of it here, typical boarding house construction of two units kind of side by side here, and then another two units over here, putting them together to make them longer and longer. So then if we finally look at this boarding house here, or this house here, it was probably not a boarding house, it was built after 1841, as I say. You notice it has a side wing on it here, it didn't move when the railroad spur came through, and that's this house that sits here next to that row house. So it's a duplex, it's two apartments side by side here. And unfortunately, the little wing that came off the left side here, it was removed in the early 1900s and a chimney put in its place. This house is interesting because it probably was originally a duplex, not a boarding house. And one of the early occupants of it was Isaac R. Scott, who at the time he lived here in the 1850s, was the manager in charge of the bleachery. He then went on to become the agent in charge of the entire Boston Manufacturing Company. So then if we look further down the street, we see a long row of row houses. So this is the other end of that row house. This is kind of the classic example of apartment row houses that the Boston Manufacturing Company built to house their workforce as it changed over from the kind of mill girl era into the family man era. Okay, now a quick look, because I know it's getting late and I apologize for that. A quick look at these three houses here, which were privately owned originally, but then taken over by the Boston Manufacturing Company for company housing later on. Just a quick word about the Dr. Francis Field house. That house does not exist anymore, unfortunately, but it's interesting to know who Francis Field was. He was a dentist in town, but he also invented blackboard chalk. And the company that he then went on to found eventually became the Crayola Crayon Company. Long story with Parmenter and everybody else involved, but so that was Dr. Francis Field, whose house is now gone, unfortunately. But these two houses do still exist, and so we'll talk about them briefly. The Whitman house here has been greatly changed. So let's start with the Newhall house, Chauncey Newhall house, located here, basically on the corner of Jackson and River Streets. And that's what this house looks like today, almost the way it looked when it was built in 1834. And this is almost a classic example of what was called a Federal period I house. It's called an I house because it's just a simple rectangular thing like the body of an I, the letter I without the dot over it. And basically 1 room deep, 5 bays or windows across. It's symmetric about the entrance, and it had an entrance hall that was in the middle of the house and went basically through the depth of the house, with 2 windows in each room on each side, 1 room having 2 windows on each side of the central hall. If we look at the back of the house, here we see the rear L coming out the back of that house, and notice the 2 chimneys here, which are inside the house but against the rear wall. And that's where the fireplaces typically were for these Federal period I houses. So there was a fireplace heating the 2nd floor bedrooms coming to that chimney, and also the 1st floor rooms here coming to that chimney. And usually the kitchen, or very often the kitchen, was in the rear L. And so probably there was a fireplace on the back of this chimney here into this L where the kitchen and the cooking was done. But very typically you'll see the 2 smokestacks at the rear of these Federal period I houses. Now this is the Bernard Whitman house originally. And again, I think this is something that I noted. This house is actually on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's called I'm blanking out on the name here.
Gilbray Inn.
Gilbray Inn, thank you. Yes, the Gilbray Inn. And we'll come to the story of the Gilbray Inn. Actually, the Bernard Whitman house was built in 1831. Bernard Whitman was the minister of the Second Religious Society from 1825 to 1834. When he died, he had this house built for himself in 1831. And I think what you can see is that first of all, here we have these 5 windows symmetric across the front, the same way, almost identical to what we had in the Chauncey Newhall house that we just looked at. And here we have this funny spacing of the front windows, and that's because I think the original house probably ended here, and you can kind of picture that it had a gable roof over it like this. This house, Chauncey Newhall house, had a typical footprint like a Federal period house until 1860, when it was bought by the Boston Manufacturing Company from Whitman's widow. And they then remodeled it in 1860. They didn't tear it down. Newspaper articles say it was not torn down, it was modified. And then in the 1920s, it was remodeled again. And it was in the 1920s that it took the shape it currently has, with the Second Empire roof and so on, and the sides going back flush all the way. Also, Gilbray was a type of cloth that the Boston Manufacturing Company produced starting in the early 1900s. So the name Gilbray Inn started about 1920. but it is known historically as a Gilbray Inn, even though, in fact, the core of it was originally the Reverend Bernard Whitman house. Now, Reverend Bernard Whitman is noted, first of all, because he was the minister of the Second Religious Society. And let me remind you, I pointed out before on this painting from Elijah Smith Jr. of the Mills that's that church that we see over here that stood at this point in time on the corner of Church and School Streets opposite First Parish, where First Parish is today. Unfortunately, in 1829, it was struck by lightning and burned, and this is actually a picture, a painting of the fire that's in the possession of the Waltham Historical Society. And so that's what the meeting house looked like as it burned. So it burned in 1829, and it was rebuilt on Boston Common, what we now know as the Common. This is Main Street here. This was the Rumford building, which I'll talk about in a minute here. And the new church was built just to the right of the Rumford building. This photograph is from the Waltham Public Library collection and was taken in 1891. So that church was long gone by then, but it shows where it was. You'll notice back here, that's the music hall building, which of course still sits on the Common on Elm Street. But it's good to show the Rumford building here also because it turns out that Reverend Bernard Whitman was the driving force behind establishing the Rumford Institute. And the Rumford Institute was this kind of educational organization that was established by the Boston Manufacturing Company for the intellectual betterment of its employees, but it was open to the general public. It included a lending library that was originally housed in this building that formed the core, the initial core of the Waltham Public Library collection. And there were very famous speakers who came and gave lectures at the Rumford Institute. And some of the names you'll recognize here, just some examples: Louis Agassiz, Horace Mann, Ralph Waldo Emerson, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and Mark Twain were some of the kinds of names of the people who gave lectures here. It's also interesting to note that the Rumford Institute eventually gave rise to the Lowell Institute that we still have today. And of course, it was from the Lowell Institute that WGBH Broadcasting developed. And so, in fact, that traces its roots back here to Waltham. So it really all did start in Waltham. Okay, the Waltham Public Library has the original documents from the Rumford Institute in its possession, and I was able to take pictures of some of them. So this is the Constitution and Bylaws of the Rumford Institute for Mutual Instruction, I guess that says, and date December 20th, 1826. And you'll notice here that signing as the committee writing and setting up the Institute is our friend Bernard Whitman here. Okay, so now we're approaching the end of the talk here. And that's this region here, bordered by Jackson Street, Central Street, Newton Street, and River Street, or really the river down here. And this was an area where there were large estates. Now, summer estates were fairly common in Waltham. You're probably familiar with the Gore Estate and the Lyman Estate and the Payne Estate, which were summer estates for these wealthy Bostonians who basically brought their families out of Boston during the summer to get away from the heat, the dust, and the disease that infected those cities at that time. Well, we had a number of those estates along the river here in Waltham. So this is that same view. Now, this is a panoramic or bird's eye view map that was drawn of Waltham, dated 1873. Here is Newton Street here. This is River Street running along here. This is Central Street here, Main Street up here. This is one of those summer estates here. This was a summer estate of, well, earlier in the 1820s, but the estate house still stood there in 1873, and it was still on estate in 1873 of Dr. James Jackson. Now, Dr. James Jackson was the brother of Patrick Tracy Jackson, and he was an eminent physician in Boston. He was a founder of Harvard Medical School and Mass General Hospital. And so he had his summer estate here that he bought in 1825. Eventually, that estate went to Francis Cabot Lowell Jr., who was the son of the founder of the mill, Francis Cabot Lowell. And don't forget that they were brother-in-laws of Francis Cabot Lowell, the Jackson brothers. And so Francis Cabot Lowell Jr., who then inherited or bought out his estate and had it in the 1870s, was his nephew, actually. And this is the Patrick Tracy Jackson estate here on the east side, the west side rather, of Newton Street. And this was the estate house here for the Patrick Tracy Jackson estate. Now, Patrick Tracy Jackson bought his estate in 1827, although he had been living on it as the employee of the Boston Manufacturing Company. He'd been living there in this estate house down here even earlier. And you'll notice that the estate stretched west of Jackson Street here and north of Central Street up here originally in 1827. Now, it pays to say just a couple words about Patrick Tracy Jackson. I've already said that he helped Lowell develop the mill. He went and purchased the land in Waltham that then became the Boston Manufacturing Company area in Waltham. He also was responsible for organizing the effort to found the town of Lowell and the mills that developed in Lowell. And in fact, he was responsible with his own money originally for buying the land in East Chelmsford that eventually became the town of Lowell. And so he founded at least 2 mills up in the town of Lowell. He also was responsible for founding the first steam railroad company in Massachusetts. So Patrick Tracy Jackson was basically a giant of the early American Industrial Revolution. When he, unfortunately, he invested a lot of his money in real estate. And during the financial panic of 1837, he lost most of his money and so had to sell off his estate. The northern part of his estate up here, he had already sold to George Miller, who developed Central Street area up here, but Miller then resold in 1839 to George Lawton, who was a member of the board of directors of the Boston Manufacturing Company area here for Lawton's first estate. Meanwhile, Jackson sold off the southern part of his estate here to a guy named Dwight Boyden in 1838. And so Boyden then took possession of the estate house, which, as you can see, was shown down here. Dwight Boyden is interesting. He was the founder and builder and owner of the Tremont House in Boston. And the Tremont House in Boston was the first luxury hotel in the country to have indoor plumbing and running water in it. And so he was fairly well off and an influential person, and he bought the estate, the southern part of the estate, in 1838. And again, as I say, was able to use the estate house that Jackson had done it. Then in 1857, Lawton bought out the southern part too, again, using the estate house down here, as well as Lawton bought this area over here, which was the Chauncey Newhall estate. And then Lawton died in 1880, and the Boston Manufacturing Company bought his property. So all the southern part here of the original Patrick Tracy Jackson estate. And it was in 1889 then that the Boston Manufacturing Company moved the original Mill Girl boarding houses to this part over here on the left, on the east, or the west rather, which was Jackson place, and the two-story boarding houses over here along Lawton Place. And they also, by the way, then after 1880, used the original mansion from the Patrick Tracy Jackson estate for worker housing. And so here is that original Patrick Tracy Jackson estate house, which then became Dwight Boyden's estate house, and then ultimately George Lawton's estate house. You can see it had a central block here that was 3 rooms deep, 3 bays deep. And then it had 2 side wings, one on each side that was 2 stories high, coming off of it straight across like that. So this is from the 1873 bird's eye view. This is the view from an 1883 panoramic or bird's eye view map of Waltham. And again, the same kind of construction, the 3 bays deep for the central block, and the 2 two-story wings coming off the sides towards the rear of the main block. I might point out the smudge here is actually a set of bay windows on the end of it. It's a little clearer in the original, unfortunately. And so that house, what I've been able to deduce, was moved in 1930 from its original location to make room for Amory and Rayham streets. So it was moved over from its original location here in the center of the lot over to sit on River Street by the corner of Jackson Street. And so that's this house here. And if you look at the footprint of this house today versus the footprint of this house here, you'll notice that not only was it shifted over by about 400 feet, but it was also rotated halfway around. So the front of it became the back, and the back became the front along River Street. And that's what the house looks like today. So a very odd-shaped house. When I was investigating this area, I couldn't understand why this house would have been built the way it was until I realized that this is the very historic Patrick Tracy Jackson, Dwight Boyden, and George Lawton mansion. And this is what it looks like from the back. Again, you can see the kind of 3 large room deep main block with the two-story wings coming, and it even has that set of bay windows on the correct end. So a couple final words then to wrap up. First of all, thank you for your attention. Sorry it's gone on so long. As I mentioned before, these green dots in these houses all signify buildings, very historic buildings from industrial history point of view, especially the history of our city, all still exist going back to 1817 in some cases. I think we're extremely blessed by having so many of these historic buildings still exist, but there's a lesson to be learned here if we look at Central Street. Central Street was laid out by George Miller in 1833 and 1834, and lots of the houses that were on Central Street up until a few years ago dated back to the 1830s and 1840s. Now, I haven't indicated all of them, only the ones from Jackson Street going west. There are a lot of other streets off the side streets here and Central Street itself and Newton Street that go back to the antebellum period. as well as later periods. Many historic houses here. I highly recommend you acquire my tour book, which does detail all of these houses and their history. But what I did want to point out was this stretch of Central Street here, the southern side of Central Street up until 6 years ago had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 houses that all dated from the 1830s and 1840s. They were the original houses built on Central Street in the antebellum period. However, in the last 6 years, we've lost 3 of those houses, all 3 of these houses in a row that presented a wonderful streetscape of antebellum Waltham are now gone. And this one house here on the corner of Jackson Street with a yellow dot on it is because even though that house was standing last week, it's not clear whether it will be standing next week. An owner bought it, a new owner bought it. He wanted to rip it down. The Historical Commission put a year-long demolition delay on it, which is the most that the commission can do. And that delay has now run out. And so this 1841 Greek Revival house may also probably still, may quickly disappear. And so half of the houses here, roughly that dated to that early period within the last half dozen years have disappeared. And that, given this real estate market that we're in now, could very easily happen to these very historic houses that still exist today, but may not exist tomorrow. Whether something can be done or not, I don't know. You know, that's something that if someone really wants to, you might talk to the mayor and talk to your city councilors, whether there's some way of encouraging owners to preserve their historic houses rather than just rip them down to put in new houses. The final note I wanted to make here before we leave is that Waltham owes a great deal to the Boston Manufacturing Company. It's really the reason we became a city. I mean, the watch company, of course, is very important, and all the derivative industries are important, but it all started, as far as industry goes, with the Boston Manufacturing Company. But the success of the Boston Manufacturing Company depended on a supply of cheap cotton fiber. And of course, that cheap cotton fiber meant that it came from the American South. And so we know that that fiber was produced by slave labor. And so it's something for us to think about, that we too owe something to that era. Okay, and with that, I will close. I thank you for your attention.